All right, good evening. If you got a Bible, we're going to be in Genesis 31 tonight. We're going to look at the whole chapter, but we won't get all of the text in there. I will have it on the screen as well. We're looking for a while now at lessons from the life of Jacob. And so we followed his story from birth, and we're going to go all the way to his death. And we're really at a major transition in his life. He's moving from the place where he's spent 20 years and going back to the place where he grew up. So if you've ever made a move in your life, you know that's a major transition point. And he's going to begin really a new chapter of his life. So the things we're going to be looking at beyond this will be a little bit different. It's a new chapter. But it's interesting to me the way that the narrative slows down at this point, at this transition point. We're going to see that chapters 31 through 34 are all focused on this transition point in his life. It's like this moment is huge for Jacob. And so the narrative, the storytelling really slows down and we get a lot of detail here. The part we're looking at right now is he's parting ways with Laban, who has been a 20-year thorn in his side. He is more than ready to move on from Laban, his uncle, his boss, his father-in-law, this guy who's like looking in a mirror. He's a deceiver like Jacob. Now, I assume most of us have had or have a Laban in our life. Don't look around. I assume we've all had a Laban in our life. One of those people that you feel like you're just in constant tension with. Perpetually frustrated. Doesn't matter what you do, there's going to be tension. And when you live in that situation for a while, it will suck the life out of you and your joy. And it's like everything is affected by that relationship. Maybe it's a neighbor or a coworker or your boss or a classmate. Maybe it's your sibling. Again, don't look. Or a spouse. In all kinds of places, we can have these relationships that we're just frustrated. Well, this is where Jacob's at. He is done with Laban, and he is one chapter from being rid of Laban, but there's another lesson that's got to come out. God tends to not let us give up that quickly. He's got more to teach us. What I've found is that in those relationships where I experience tension, that some of my ugliest behavior comes out. Some of the ugliest things come out with those people that I have tension with. I think this text it steps on my toes, but it also just gives some help for those relationships, some counsel, some wise counsel for those relationships. So let's look at it. Genesis 31, verse 1. Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all this wealth. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. Okay, so a couple of things here. The tension is rising between Jacob and Laban. It's not been good for 20 years, but something has changed even now. It's worse. If you remember last week, he tried to resign. He tried to move on 6 years ago, and he ended up signing a new deal. God wasn't done with the things that needed to happen in that relationship, so he has been there for 6 more years. And in the process, as Laban schemed, God outblessed. And so here he is 6 years later. He is made prosperous, and that does not sit well with Laban and his family. They see that Jacob is prospering and their father is not. Now, it wasn't time to move on before, but now it is. God told Jacob it was time to move. Okay, before he thought, okay, I'm ready to move on. But now God is telling him, it's time. Go. It's time to leave. So in verses 4 through 16, we won't read this. God has told him to move. He goes and he talks to his wives. He gives them his perspective. And then here is their response. Remember, he's got these two wives. We've already talked about that. Here's the way they respond. Verse 14, then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you to do, whatever God has said to you, do. Okay, now everybody's on the same page. This doesn't happen. God said it's time to move. Jacob's like, I've been ready. And he talks to his wives. Yes, whatever God said, do it. Our father has not treated us right. It's time to go. So it's a clear deal. We're leaving. But now we see the parting shots, which is what we tend to do sometimes. We're moving on. And we're like, well, I'm going to get one more little jab in there. One little cutting remark. One more thing as I leave. And so we're going to see him sort of stick it. Verse 17. So Jacob arose, set his sons and his wives on camels. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with, He fled with all that he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. Now, I've underlined a couple of words there because they're the same word. And in Hebrew, the repetition is really important to notice. And this is a key word that's repeated over and over again in here. Stole. Rachel stole her father's household gods. So he had these little small figurines of some kind, would have been wood or metal. We're not sure exactly why. And we don't know exactly why. We don't know if Rachel is still sort of tied up in some idolatry or if this is a matter of inheritance and she's taking her inheritance, what she can get of it, or if it's just spite. I'm just going to stick it to him. He's not treated us right. I'm going to take his little gods. She stole her father's household gods. And then Jacob, literally, here's what it says in Hebrew, stole his heart, which means he tricked or he deceived him. That's why it's interpreted that way. But it's the repetition is saying both of them are doing something that's sort of underhanded here. Stealing his God, stealing his heart. We might put it this way. Jacob is right to leave, but leaving wrong. God has said it's time to go, but the way they leave is sort of underhanded. It's deceitful. It's taking. It's in spite or for whatever reason, we're going to sort of stick it to Laban on the way out. And I always just sit and think, okay, where do I do this? And led me to a place I'm not real comfortable going, passive-aggressive behavior. And so last week we talked about selective breeding, and I'll tell you I'm a little bit more comfortable talking about ag things than I am psychology. But passive-aggressive behavior, just simple definition here, expressing anger indirectly. When we know what direct aggression is, right? You can spot that pretty easy. But indirect aggression is when you're aggressive, but you're doing it in an indirect way. It's not always noticeable. You make your point in evasive, underhanded, or deceitful ways. This is kind of Jacob's MO. This is sort of what he does. I think it's some of what's going on here. It's kind of a passive-aggressive move. What can Laban do now? We're gone. We're going to stick it to him on the way out. Sometimes we do this. We're frustrated with somebody, and instead of talking with them about it, we just give them the silent treatment. Instead of talking about what the issue is, we just make sure they can tell by our tone and our facial expression that we're unhappy. We have a way of making life miserable for somebody that we're around without ever really dealing with the problem. We might have good reason to be upset. We might even be right. But the way we're dealing with it is wrong. fact, I think that sometimes the way we deal with a tense situation, with a situation or relationship where there's some conflict, the way we deal with it is actually escalating it. It's actually making it worse. And that's what passive-aggressive behavior does. It doesn't fix anything in the relationship. If anything, it just makes it worse. Well, it's going to get worse, and we're going to see Laban and Jacob and draw out some things I think that we can learn from this. Look at verse 22. This is Laban's pursuit. This is how Laban responds to what Jacob and his wives have done. When it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsmen with him and pursued him for 7 days and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. Now, that word pursued connotes hostility. It's sort of like an army word. It's when you read it, it's like his intent was to harm. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." So it's interesting here. We've got God intervening in a dream as he's accustomed to do. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done?" Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword?" That phrase there, "what have you done?" That's interesting because that's the exact same thing that Jacob said when Laban tricked him into marrying the wrong sister. He says, "What have you done?" And now it comes full circle, and Laban's going, "What have you done?" Laban goes on, verse 27. "Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly." You read that and you think, yeah, I'm sure, Laban, yeah, you would have really handled that well. You know, everything we've learned has probably told us he would not have handled it quite that way. But at the same time, you got to think, how would you like it if one day your son-in-law, for all the tension you've had, is just gone? That's a passive-aggressive move. Just going to leave. You're going to come home from dealing with the sheep, and all your family's going to be gone, and I got the last one in. I got the last hit. It's going to hurt. He knows it's going to sting. He says, "This is a foolish thing that you've done. Why would you treat me this way? It is in my power to do you harm," he says, "but the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" That repetition is important there. "And now you have gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" Jacob answered and said to Laban, to the first question, "Because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force." And to the second question, "Anyone with whom you find your God shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours and take it." Okay. He says, "Now I had good reason to leave without telling you, but the gods, no, I don't have those. You're not going to find them here." Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. That was an underhanded move that Rachel had done. Jacob didn't know about this. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out to Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." So he searched, but did not find the household gods. All right. So a couple of things I want to bring out here as far as just some wisdom for these tense relationships. The first is be careful with your words. I think it's really interesting that God came to Laban in a dream, and he said, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." And that's repeated in verse 29. Now, I've struggled with that because it sounds like what he's saying is don't talk to him. And so don't say anything at all. And then you see them interact and you go, well, what's going on with this interaction? I don't think that what God is saying here is don't talk at all. Literally in Hebrew it says don't say anything from good to bad. And so a lot of people have commented on that as far as that saying don't use your words in a deceptive way. I'm not real sure. The sense of it seems to be careful what you say that you don't harm Jacob. That's really interesting. You've got a guy who's pursuing him. It looks like he's very hostile toward him, and God says be careful what you say. That's really important that we think about in those relationships where we feel that tension and hostility. Wouldn't we do well to listen to God, say, be careful about what you say? Be careful with your words. I know that my words are not, the ugliest words are usually in a situation where I feel that tension and that frustration. Good counsel to say, what's your words? Proverbs 12:18 says, there is one whose rash words, thoughtless words, hurried words, words you just say, and then you go, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. They just come out. They're like sword thrusts. They wound. They do damage. They hurt. But the tongue of the wise, that is a person who speaks with words that have been thought through, they're thoughtful words, wise words, brings healing. It's a proverb that's about the power of your words, that your words have power to do destructive things in a person's life or to heal them, to bring healing to a person. How are your words? Be careful with your words. Second, don't jump to conclusions. Genesis 31:30, Laban has he's kind of laid out all the things that Jacob has done, and then his last question is, but why did you steal my gods? Why'd you do that? You know, that one really bugged him. And who did he address? Who did he assume did it? Jacob. Had to be Jacob. That's where the tension is, right? It was actually his daughter. Jacob didn't know anything about it. Now, I think Jacob was pretty foolish to say, hey, you just kill whoever it is you find with it. But the point here is that Laban assumed Jacob had done it, and Jacob didn't know anything about it. Proverbs 25:7-8 says, whatever your eyes have seen, do not hastily bring into court. For what will you do in the end when your neighbor puts you to shame? Sometimes, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, we talked about not judging. We don't always see clearly. And a lot of times, especially with the person we've got tension with, we assume the worst things about them. And our assumptions about them aren't always right. Whether it be their motives or what they've done, we just tend to pile on and attribute to somebody we're frustrated with all kinds of things that they might not have had anything to do with. Might not be true at all. Be careful that you're not jumping to conclusions. Okay, so that's Laban. Now let's look at Jacob. Verse 36. Then Jacob became angry and berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, what is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? For you have felt through all my goods. What have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes, your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. What was torn by wild beast I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or by night. There I was. By day the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, 6 years for your flocks, and you've changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. Okay, I'm probably not getting the tone on that right. You can tell he's a little angry. All right. Be slow to anger. That whole speech started out, then Jacob became angry and berated Laban. And he goes on to unload 20 years of pent-up steam. Just lets it loose. And every time I read it, I don't know, I think that most recent years, the more I read it, the more uncomfortable I am with just seeing, man, I do that. I hold in this anger. I don't say anything for a long time. I do passive-aggressive things. And then finally the moment comes and I just unload. It just comes out. James, wisdom of James, chapter 1, 19 through 20. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. That slow to anger is one of those attributes of God. When God says, here's what my character is, this is what I'm like, he says, I'm slow to anger. We can be so quick to anger. And generally what comes out of that when we just unload that pent-up steam is not good. It's not righteous. We might want to call it that. We might call it righteous anger. But I don't think it is a lot of times. It's just anger. It's not accomplishing anything. Don't get self-righteous. The very end of that speech, it says, God saw, this is the way Jacob interprets what has happened. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands, and he rebuked you. This righteous anger. You go feeling a little self-righteous there, Jacob? I'm in the right. You're in the wrong. Oh my, watch out for that. Those relationships where we get tense, man, it's so easy to get to thinking, I'm the one in the right, they're the one in the wrong, and it may be to some degree that you're right and they're wrong. But if you look pretty close, my guess is that there's wrong on both sides. Philippians is a great book to deal with conflict. And I love the way that Paul deals. There's a situation where you've got these two women in the congregation who aren't in agreement. There's some reconciliation that needs to happen. And Paul waits until chapter 4 to say, you need to be of the same mind. You need to agree. But he's already paved the way. And in chapter 2, he used that same phrase, to be of the same mind. It's like he's already established before he ever said, y'all need to work this out. He has said, here's the way you do it. And it's in that section where he says this, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. When it comes to working out conflict or disagreements, the posture is humility. It's having this mindset, especially where you disagree with somebody. Not that I'm the one that's righteous, I'm the one that's better. Thank God I'm not like that tax collector over there. Guard against that. Instead, think about the interest of others. Not how can I stick it to them, but what would do them good. Having a humble point of view. Let's look at the end here, just real briefly. This surprises me, and I wrestled a lot with this in my preparation. Verse 43. Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. Okay, that's his way of saying we disagree. This isn't your stuff, this is my stuff. But what can I do this day for these my daughters or for their children whom they have borne? And this is really interesting to me. It sort of changes right here. What can I do this day for my daughters? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. Now, this is I told you, it's a transition moment. The last time we had one of these pillar stones was in chapter 28. 20 years earlier, when he was leaving home, setting out on his own, has this encounter with God, sets up a pillar stone. Now he's leaving where he's been for 20 years and moving on, and we've got another one of those monument times where he sets up a pillar. And we can see now that even though these 20 years have been frustrating, we can see God's faithfulness through all of that. The pillar stone here is marking this covenant. They've made some agreement, Jacob and Laban. Agreement to do no further harm. We're not going to read all of that. If you read going down through verse, we're going to read 55 in a moment, but going down through verse 55, you see that they establish an agreement together. God is going to be a witness and judge between them. They will not harm each other anymore. It's fascinating to me that even as they do that, they can't agree on the name. It just doesn't matter what they do. There's tension here. They can't agree on the name, but they're establishing some kind of covenant. There's a meal that is shared. They stay the night, and then look at how it ends. Verse 55. Early in the morning, Laban arose, kissed his grandchildren and his daughters, and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. It's just such a surprising end. And I've wrestled with this because the whole story is really messy. Every aspect of this is messy. And even this covenant, you try to work through what does it mean and what are they doing? There's nothing picture perfect about this. But it is interesting to me that you see God intervening, God working in this relationship between two guys where they were going to be just completely just cut off. Jacob just leaves. Instead, you actually have the very thing that probably wasn't going to happen at the start, that Laban blessed his grandchildren and his daughters, and there's some level of peace there. It's just not what you expect. I don't think it's what Jacob expected. I don't think it's what Laban expected. I don't think anybody expected this. And it just sort of stands out. Something unusual here, some level of harmony. So just finish this way. My takeaway from this. Relationships matter to God. Even the ones that we're ready to walk away from. Even the ones that we're quick to dismiss. The ones we're frustrated. The ones that we say nothing good's happening here. That relationship matters to God. Even when it's time to move on. Maybe you're changing jobs, or you're moving to a new place, or changing churches, or breaking up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Sometimes that moving on needs to happen. That relationship matters to God. And harmony is a hallmark of His people. This is not a perfect, harmonious relationship at the end. But there's more harmony than it started with. And I think sometimes we're too quick, too ready to settle with disharmony and just say, I'm just going to move on. And I think we need to be challenged by Jesus that there's more harmony possible even where there's tension than we might think. But you know what it's going to take? Well, it's going to take the things we talked about in there. Not jumping to conclusions, not being angry, being humble, being interested in the other person, putting their interest above your own, all of those things. But it's going to take a lot of forgiveness, a lot of grace. And our relationships need that. That's what makes relationships work. Not two people getting it right, not me meeting all of your expectations or treating you right in every way. What really makes it work is grace. We got to have that for relationships. Well, let's pray together. Father, we thank you for your word, for this story. Thank you for the ways that you are involved in our relationships with one another and others. We're grateful for the unity that is possible in Jesus, for the ways that you have not given up on us and reconciled us to you, even when we were hostile and enemies and unworthy in every way. You have not given up on us. We recognize that you've called us to be a people who strive for peace and unity and who are willing to extend grace and forgiveness. And I pray that we will be sensitive to your leading and counsel in those ways, that we will not be dismissive of relationships that you are not dismissive of. That we will be humble and gracious and loving and forgiving with one another. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, this evening, if you have something you want to share with the church family, we need to pray, or if you're not a Christian, you want to be baptized tonight, I invite you to come to the front while we stand and sing.